Karen Anderson was in a completely different world. When a man with a much larger than usual member gave her pleasure, she had already experienced several climaxes since she had walked into that motel room about an hour ago, and all of them were in her opinion much better than anything she had experienced with Cale, who she lived with for 10 years. Any guilt she felt about cheating on her husband was soon overshadowed by a feeling of pleasure. In fact, Karen wasn't even sure why she was doing this. Everything was going well. Between her and Cale, he always treated her like a queen, spoiled her, bought her gifts and flowers spontaneously just to say I love you, and making love to each other was good, although it had slowed down a bit. Lately they had 2 wonderful children, and in general everything was great, but for some strange reason she decided to give in. A yawn, maybe it was the months she spent in the office getting seduced, or maybe it was the gossip she heard about the giant member in Y's pants from the other girls in the office. Maybe it was all of those things together. At first she worried about how it would affect her marriage and her family, but all that disappeared when she walked into the room. Now all she cared about was absorbing everything she could from this man. In the short time they would spend together, even if it meant getting pregnant with him at that moment, all thoughts about Cale had flown from her mind. There was no guilt anymore, just the need for another time. She thought she would make it up to her ignorant husband. Maybe she would even teach him to do what John did to her after every script the man who was now unconscious in that bed, cheap motel room had made her experience an amazing time. He laid down on the bed next to her, and the 2 lovers fell asleep in each other's arms, promising her the clock said 8:30, which gave her enough time to get cleaned up and get home. She told Cale that they would work late, but she would be home no later than 10:30. The motel was only a half-hour drive from her house, so she had plenty of time to get cleaned up and get home to her husband. She looked to the other side of the bed and noticed that Ian had already left. She didn't remember him leaving, and she found it strange that he would go home to his wife without telling her anything. She decided to tell him everything she thought when she saw him at the office the next day. She also noticed that Joe's side of the bed looked like she had never been there. There was someone strange there, she thought, but decided that he was probably as tidy as he was talented. She went into the bathroom, examined herself, and noticed that apart from a slight swelling between her legs, it hadn't left any visible marks. That was good, she thought, as she didn't want to have to explain bruises or strange marks on her body. She showered for a long time, using 2 vaginal rinses to get herself as clean as possible. She didn't want to risk bringing Jan's bodily fluids into Cale's house. At least not yet, after carefully examining herself. She put her work clothes back on and got ready to leave, taking one last look at the room to make sure she didn't forget anything. Karen dropped the room key and then looked around to make sure no one knew her. The only person she noticed was a rather strange man in an old-fashioned gray suit standing in the corner, and, looking at her, she thought it was familiar somehow, but she couldn't remember it. She was holding a cigarette in one hand and the other in her pocket. However, what surprised her was the lack of natural color. She looked like a character straight out of a black and white TV show from the 60s. She walked back to her car, got in, and noticed the inside was covered in dust and smelled damp, as if the car had been sitting idle for a long time. It's strange, just a few hours ago, everything was different. She thought. She rolled down the window to air it out and tried to start the car. At first it wouldn't start, but after stepping on the accelerator a few times, it came to life and black smoke came out of the exhaust pipe. She stepped on the accelerator a few times to make sure the car would start, making a mental note to ask her husband to do it. She checked in the morning. She headed home, wondering if Cale would notice any change in her. Hopefully, not even it. She noticed she got home a few minutes before 10 and saw 2 strange cars in her driveway. This is strange. She thought Kylie didn't say anything about having company. The house also looked a little different. All the curtains were wrong and the landscaping had completely changed, of course. Kylie couldn't do all this in a day, and certainly not without consulting her. She thought. She checked the address first to make sure she was home correct. Then she pulled up on the street. She has some explaining to do, she said to herself. She got out of the car and entered the house, noticing everything was wrong. There was strange furniture in the living room. All of her prized pictures and items were gone, replaced. And to make matters worse, there was an older black couple sitting on the couch looking at her strangely. "Who are you and why are you in my house?" Karen asked. The man stood up and looked at Karen strangely. "I am Aljor Henson," he said. "And this is my wife Amanda," he added, pointing to the attractive woman who was sitting next to him. "Who could be you, miss, and why are you in our house?" My name is Karen Anderson, and I have lived in this house with my husband, Cale, for the past 8 years. He said, I don't understand what is going on, miss. I think you should leave now. He said, we bought this home to Mr. Anderson a year ago, after their divorce was finalized. Divorce, Karen asked. In SOC. What kind of divorce? I was here this morning with my husband before I left for work. Al started to approach Karen. Miss, I really think you should leave before I have to call the police. Yes, please call the police. He said, Karen, something is going on here and I intend to get to the bottom of this. This must be one of Cale's pranks. Al picked up his phone and dialed 9111 after talking to the dispatcher. He hung up and spoke to Karen. The police will be here in a few minutes. He said you can sit down if you would like to wait for them here. He added, pointing to the deep chair next to the couch. Karen sat down wondering what she should do, then pulled out her smartphone and suddenly realized she was down this too. It was strange since she always kept it charged so that Cale or her children could contact her at any time. Sorry to bother you, but can I use your phone to call my husband? Karen asked. Of course. No problem, he said, Al handing her his phone. Karen dialed Cale's number from memory, but got a message that said the number was no longer in use. Distraught, she tried to dial her parents' number but got the same answer. She also tried to call Cale's parents but got a quick, busy signal. Discouraged, and with no options, she handed the phone back to Al. You are saying they bought this house a year ago from my husband, Karen? Asked Al. He nodded. Yes, we did. He said he sold it to us at a very good price. And said it was for a divorce. He said something about why he was getting a divorce. Amanda asked. He spoke. He mentioned something about a woman cheating on him as a wife. He said. Looking at Karen suspiciously, Karen was shocked. How could he have found this out? So soon after her first date with poor man, I could see he was heartbroken. And these poor kids made me so sorry for this moment. Karen was already crying. Her life and marriage had fallen apart without her even knowing it. Shortly after, a police car with lights flashing pulled up in front of the house. 2 police officers appeared at the door. He spoke to them first and then invited them in. Karen stood up when they entered. Please, show us some ID. Miss, said one of the officers. Karen opened her purse and took out her driver's license. The officer looked at them, then turned to Karen. Is this some kind of joke, ma'am? He asked. This license is empty. What Karen asked. Looking at the license, the laminated driver's card the officer was holding was completely blank. There was not even a picture under it. Underneath the laminate, is there any other identification? The officer asked. I have something in my purse, she said. Karen. But when Karen opened her purse, she found that all of her other cards were completely blank. I don't understand, she said. There should be credit cards, an ATM card, my social security card. But they are all empty. Can you at least tell us your name? Another officer asked. Maybe there is something in the system. Of course, Karen said. My name is Karen Anderson, and I live in West Highland Park with my husband. I work as a paralegal at the Jenkins law firm downtown. Surely someone there can vouch for me. The officers looked at each other before turning their attention back to Karen. You said Karen Anderson, ma'am, asked the second officer. Yes, I said Karen Anderson. Is spelled K-R-H-E, said ma'am. You will have to come with us to the station so we can confirm your identity, said the first officer. We apologize for interrupting your night, guys, he said to Al and Amanda. The officers took Karen to the police car and put her in the back seat. After locking her inside, one of the officers approached Karen's car and rummaged through the glove compartment, taking out some documents. They drove silently to the police station where they took Karen's fingerprints, and she was taken to what appeared to be an interrogation room. Half an hour later, the door opened and a plainclothes detective walked into the room with a folder in his hands, sat down in front of Karen, and placed the folder in front of him, went through all the preliminary procedures informing her of her rights and assuring her that she was not suspected of any crime. All I want to do is confirm your identity, okay? Asked Karen. She nodded. You said your name was Karen Anderson, right? He asked. Yes, she said. And you told our officers that you live at 1550 A. Watts High and Park Road with your husband Cale. Added, he is true. She said you also said that you work at the Jenkins law firm as a paralegal. Isn't that right? He asked. Yes, that's true, said Karen. We have a little problem here, Miss Anderson said. The detective, let's start with the fact that your fingerprints don't exist. I don't mean they're not in the system. I mean, you don't have any fingerprints. It looks like they weren't even removed with acid. They just don't exist. And that's not all. We checked the records for this address and found out that it was bought by Allie Amanda Jorgensen a year ago from Kill Anderson. According to court records, the house was sold as part of a divorce settlement between Cale and Karen Anderson. Said Karen was shocked what he was talking about, all this about divorce. But I'm still married to my husband. I saw him this very morning. I don't understand how this is possible, she said through tears. Look, miss, I'm just going by what it says in the court records. Please tell me, where were you there tonight? Asked the detective. I was at the Gaslight Motel room 1 to 17, she said in a low voice. And what were you doing there? He asked. I was, with a man, she said, she looking at the floor. What did you do with this man? Asked the detective. We were, having fun, she said, making love. Right? He asked. Karen nodded. Yes, she said. And can you identify the man you were with? Yes, she said. Hawkins. My boss at the law firm. I see, said the detective. Have you gotten used to cheating on your husband? Karen? Lucia shocked. No, I don't know. It was the first and last time, I promise. She said. Interesting, said the detective. The file we have on you includes a very detailed report from a local private investigator hired by your ex-husband. According to the report of the private investigator, saw Mr. Hawkins several times at the same motel over several months. Would you like to reconsider your statement? Karen shook her head. No. This is incorrect. She said she went there with him only once today. The detective sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking at Karen. Miss, it turns out I know the senior partners at Jenkins. I called this afternoon and was told that one Karen Anderson and her supervisor Antal Hawkins were fired almost a year ago for violating company policy, Antinucci said. But that's not all. He pulled a photograph out of the folder and placed it on the table in front of her. The photo showed a woman lying on a hotel bed with her eyes open and her face gray. The woman looked exactly like Karen. And to make matters worse, she was wearing the same outfit as Karen. Her eyes opened wide, and she raised her hand to her mouth. And soak. This picture was taken about 3 months ago, Miss, said the detective. According to the officers who responded, Karen Anderson of 150 Awat Highland Park Road was found dead in room 117 of the Gaslight Motel. 3 months ago, an autopsy revealed that Mrs. Anderson died from an overdose of sleeping pills, apparently taken with large amounts of alcohol. So, miss, can you explain to me how a woman who looks and dresses exactly like the woman found dead in a motel room 3 months ago is now walking around my property? She asked. And how did it happen that you ended up in the same room? She died in this woman. Karen shook her head in shock. No, this can't be, she exclaimed. I'm not dead. I'm right here. I don't know what's going on, please. Help me. At least tell me where my family, please. I can't get in touch with anyone. Okay, miss. I don't know where Mr. Anderson is now, but I understand he moved out of town after his divorce for sure. Your in-laws died shortly after Mrs. Anderson's body was found. Oh my God, no, please, please tell me my parents are still alive, she pleaded through tears. I'm sorry if you really are Mrs. Anderson's ex, and I'm not ready to admit it. Then I can't honestly talk to you about it, she said, sending Karen into a state of hysterics. Miss, I think you need professional help. I'm going to call the County Behavior Center and have them, and you are moved to their facility until we get this all figured out, she said, pulling out her phone. Karen shook her head. No. Please don't do this. I don't know what's going on. You have to believe me. Let me talk to my husband. At least I can't do this, ma'am. I don't even know who you are. You really look like the deceased Mrs. Anderson. You dress like her. You seem to know some intimate details of Mrs. Anderson's life. I even drove Mrs. Anderson's car, although I'm not sure how you managed to start it after being there so long. By the way, the registration plates on this car expired a long time ago, so I'm impounding it until you can prove ownership and update the registration. At this point, I think you need to talk about this with a mental health professional. Please stay here, she said as I walked out the door. Karen rested her head on the table, sobbing. This shouldn't have happened. She thought of course her husband will come to save her. The door opened, and two large men with strange clothes entered the room. As they began to put him on, Karen realized that they were putting a straitjacket on her and began to struggle. No, please don't do this to me, she said. No, oh no, she screamed over and over, but the men continued to dress her until she could no longer move her arms. She didn't scream as one of the men injected something into her neck. Within seconds, her world plunged into darkness. Thursday, May 12th, 2016, 11:30. Oh, wake up, dear, said a male voice. Wake up. Are you okay, Karen? Wake up. Karen slowly opened her eyes and saw her husband's face. Karen, you had a nightmare, but it's over now. Wake up, honey said. As Karen's mind slowly shook from the sleep, she realized she was in her bed with her husband, Cale. Instantly threw his arms around her neck and covered her face with kisses. My God, Cale, are you really you? She asked. Of course, fool. Who else would be in our bed? He replied. Hold me, Cale, please, she cried. I missed you so much. Cale hugged his wife, crying as hard as he could. He was trying to hold this beautiful woman. But he thought, what is she talking about? I'm right here, he said. I'm not going anywhere. It's better that you don't go anywhere, she said. He had calmed down a bit. Karen looked at her husband, Cale. I have something to confess to you, and I'm afraid you'll be very angry with me. He looked at her with concern. Cale, I almost made a terrible mistake, she said. He almost asked Cale, please don't you hate me, but I have to tell you this. You know we promised never to keep secrets from each other, no matter how bad they were. Yes, darling. I know you can talk to me. About anything. You know that, right? He asked. Karen nodded. Yes, I know, but it's bad. Have you met my boss, Joe Hawkins? Cale knew him well. They met at a law firm Christmas party, and Cale could tell he was a classy man who considered himself God's gift to women, basically a legend in his own imagination. He could also tell that, and he was trying to get his claws and his private parts into Karen. Yes, I remember that. Well, Cale said, he's been trying to get me to stay after work for a long time, except he doesn't want to work. You know what I mean? She said. You mean, he wants to touch you? She said. Cale, I get that you're a beautiful woman. What man in his right mind? I wouldn't want to be with you. If we weren't married, I'd be flirting with you myself. What I don't like is him knowing that you're married. Yeah. Well, he wanted us to meet at a motel to be together, she said, looking down. Oh yeah, said Cale, his mood darkening. And you accepted. No, Rami, she said. But actually, I didn't either reject him. I just dodged him a little, but wait, we'll see each other tomorrow. I can't do it, but I'm afraid it will affect my job if I don't do it. Well, I assure you, it will affect our marriage if you do this, and yes, it could also affect your job. He said, Cale, you know I won't tolerate infidelity, and your company has strict rules that prohibit adultery. You could both be fired, and if I get divorced, I know she said I haven't done anything with him yet. But I'm scared. I know he's been with a lot of other girls in the office, and they all say that he's a nice guy who uses things to get his way. Do you believe me, right? Of course I believe you, she said, Cale. You forget we've been married for 10 years, and before we met for 5 years. You've never been able to keep anything a secret from me, and the guilt eats you up alive talking about it. I noticed you've been a little out of place the last few days. At first I thought it was just work, but now I think that's the real reason, right? Karen lowered her eyes and nodded her head. Yes, she said quietly. I've been thinking about this a lot. For the past 2 days, I don't want to lose my job. Or I couldn't live without you, and I couldn't live with myself if I hurt you and the kids like this. What should I do? Are you kidding? Right? She asked Cale. You are an intelligent and educated woman. Karen, you really have to ask, or do you want me to explain it to you? You don't have to do this, Cale. I guess I just needed some validation. I know what I'll do first, she said. She, getting up from the bed, went to her closet and pulled out a dress she planned to wear the next day. It was a beautiful dress that fell a few inches above her knees. It wasn't ostentatiously attractive, but it still showed off her curves. Well, she pulled it out of the closet and threw it in the trash. "I don't want to see that dress ever again," she said. Cale looked surprised. "It was a pretty expensive dress," he said. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Karen sat up in bed. "Yes," she said. "And tomorrow I will tell Ion. Not only no, but no way. Then I will ask for a transfer to another department. Maybe my salary will be reduced, but I don't care if I don't get it. I will quit. Our marriage is more important to me, and I will do everything to stay us together. Can you forgive me sometime?" "Of course you can," he said. "Cale, I am a little upset that you didn't say no to that man right away, but at least now you are doing the right thing." Karen hugged her husband as if her life depended on it. "I can't believe I was so stupid, Cale. Please hug me and tell me you love me," he said. Cale hugged her and kissed her forehead. "Of course I love you, Karen, and I always have," he said. "But I think we need to have a serious conversation about this after you calm down, maybe even seek counseling. I can't believe you were so trusting to fall for him." "So I understand," he said. "Karen, I promise this will never happen again." She looked at the TV on the wall opposite her bed and saw him, the man she had seen on the corner of the street in her nightmare. "Cale, who is that man on the TV?" she asked. "This is Rot saying, honey. They are having a Twilight Zone marathon." "Why, you ask? I saw him before, but I didn't know who he was," she said. "How is that possible? He died in 1975 Kauai, and said he was in my nightmare. He didn't really do anything, he just stood there staring. It was black and white just like on TV, and it was just, I don't know, strange." She said, "Interesting." He said, "Cale, someday you'll have to tell me about this dream." Cale got out of bed and headed for the door. "I'm going down to get something." "Do you want something? Coke? Water?" "I want water, please," she said. After Cale left the bedroom, Karen thanked the heavens for the dream. She had suddenly realized she had almost entered the Twilight Zone of betrayal. Subscribe to our channel.